Welcome to the Engaged Jain Studies podcast, brought to you by Arihanta Institute. Listen to top figures in the fields of Jain studies, religious studies, vegan studies, and social justice discuss pressing issues of everyday relevance. Together, let's move beyond the realm of personal spiritual growth and connect philosophy, religion, and spirituality to the important task of caring for the well-being of society. Learn about your world and how to change it on the Engaged Jain Studies podcast.
Hello, and welcome to the Engaged Jain Studies podcast, brought to you by Arihanta Institute. I am your host today, Dr. Jonathan Dickstein, Assistant Professor of Jain Studies at Arihanta and Academic Lead for the Vegan Studies Initiative. For those of you new to Arihanta Institute and not only our podcast, Arihanta Institute's mission is to build a world-class online institution for deeper learning of the Jain tradition, its principles, and how these principles apply to daily life for the benefit and well-being of individuals and society. And one way this application of Jain principles manifests at Arihanta is through our Vegan Studies Initiative. And part of that initiative involves dialogues, discussions, critical thinking, critical questions with scholars in the field of vegan studies. It's from that angle that today we welcome our guest, Dr. Vasile Stanescu. Dr. Stanescu, thank you for being here.
Thank you for having me.
Wonderful. So a little bit of background here. Dr. Stanescu received his Ph.D. from Stanford University in the program of Modern Thought and Literature. He is Associate Professor of Communication Studies at Mercer University and also co-founder of the North American Association for Critical Animal Studies. Dr. Stanescu has over 25 peer-reviewed publications on the study of animals and the environment. And his work has been featured in American Behavioral Scientist, Journal of American Culture, Animal Studies Journal, and various other publications. A committed advocate for animal liberation, Dr. Stanescu has also been vegan for over 20 years. You can reach him at a few locations and he can share more with you, but most prominently at winforanimals.org. So definitely check out that site and see the wonderful work that our guest has done for so many years. So that's enough of me talking. I could go on and on about our vegan studies program and what we're putting together in the months and years ahead. But to start, could you just tell our listeners a little bit, about yourself, where you come from and how you kind of come to this field of study?
Sure, absolutely. So a little uniquely, I went vegetarian when I was 9 years old. My family is from Romania, which is a very meat-eating culture. In fact, there is no Romanian word for vegetarian. If you want to say you're vegetarian, you either have to say the English word, vegetarian, or you have to say I'm fasting. So my family, very meat-eating, father in particular, meat every meal was key. And then I actually grew up, though, in the United States, and I grew up in Georgia, the state, not the country, which was also very meat-eating. So in the town that I grew up in, there was only one other vegetarian that I ever met or knew. There was a family from India, doctors that were there, and they were vegetarian. And their son, Raj, and I basically sort of had to be friends because we were the only two vegetarians in the entire town. My first act of political activism was actually getting a salad bar into my middle school, which I think I was successful with because they were just confused that a middle school student wanted to eat salad. I even did a whole presentation at the school board, the whole 9 yards. And I was like, yes, I got the salad bar in the classroom. And I think that early success may have biased me that this was going to be a lifetime goal and struggle. But it has been. Since the age of 9, I've had one goal, and that is animal liberation. And I've stayed, whether it's been in activism or scholarship or what have you, from 9 on. And this is the goal that I've been fighting for.
Wow, that's pretty amazing. And I ask because, I didn't grow up with any of that either. I didn't know any vegetarians. I don't think a vegetarian or even I think a vegan until my 3rd year of college. I'm curious about this personally. Like, do you think this was just kind of this inborn, in a sense, consideration for animals? Was it part of your family? Did you have animals around you or anything like that catalyzed that sensibility?
So I have later done some research on this because it was kind of this unique experience, and it's not as rare as we think. So there actually was a study that came out from Harvard. Paul Harris was the researcher. It came out in 2010. And what they found is 8% of all children go vegetarian on their own. And they're not being picky eaters. Like me, they can articulate the reason. Like, I'm vegetarian for ethical reasons. They're all children, like under the age of 12. And almost all of them, they're called independent vegetarians. Their parents eat meat. It is less rare than we think. It is not human nature to eat meat. It is actually, people are socialized into eating meat. So many, many children naturally are like, no. So for me, when I was eating chicken and I first realized that chicken was chicken, I was like, okay, I love animals. I don't want to hurt them. I'm going to stop this. These are not complicated arguments for people to understand. And it was after this when I was like, well, I'm not going to eat meat anymore. And then they were like, well, you have to. What do you mean? What's wrong with you? I went to my public library in the small town in Georgia that I was in and checked out Animal Liberation and 9 or 10, whatever it was, read through it. And then I was like, no, there's a whole argument here. There's reasons. There's a term. I don't have to do this anymore. And my parents were like, you really do? And so for about a year, I ate what I could at the age of 9 or 10, like big bags of oranges, until finally they were like, okay, this is getting out of hand. And then they started making vegetarian food for me. And then we were off to the races ever since then. But many, many children actually go through a phase when they're like, no, I love animals. I'm not going to hurt them. And then what happens is the parents lie to them or trick them or say, you'll die if you don't eat meat, or meat doesn't eat the animals. And then they start eating meat again. I teach a class on veganism most academic years. And so many of my students actually have had this moment of trauma where they went vegetarian and then stopped when they were very, very young. And when we're doing this activism, what we have to remember is so many people we're talking to actually have an internalized trauma. It's not exactly that they don't know. It's that they know and have sort of forced themselves to forget.
Yeah, I think that's an important point. And I would really like to come back to the later, because you and I have spoken about it in another context of just that we're actually, in a sense, the victims of forms of propaganda and enculturation. And that even people that have this sensibility to say not eat animals, not harm animals, it's in a way taught out of them. And so when we actually, in a sense, look at non-vegetarians, non-vegans as a thing that they're kind of choosing, in a sense, to do wrong or violently, it kind of sometimes lacks what you're pointing to, right? Is this enculturation into patterns of violence or lack of sympathy or what have you.
I have a son who is 2 years old, and the whole time what I've taught him is don't hurt animals, but not just me. Every single book we check out from the library, every movie that we watch, when we watch Chicken Run, it's all like, love animals, don't hurt animals. We have a companion, Abby, our dog who lives with us. Don't hit Abby, don't hurt animals. So meat eating is this bizarre 180 from what we actually teach all children all the time. Love animals, don't hurt them. This is not a hard concept for anyone to get. And, if we were somehow naturally carnivores, we would be telling people, okay, here's how to get your kids to eat sweet potatoes by wrapping it in bacon. But the reality is exactly the opposite. There are a host of parenting guides that are like, okay, here's how to get your kid to eat meat by putting it in sweet potatoes. Naturally, we don't want to eat meat. It is societal pressure, socialization, stigma that forces us to do so.
So true. I hope we'll get to that a little bit when we talk about the ways in which animal agriculture industries create these kind of myths about needs, not just the sustainability, which we'll get to, and humane agriculture, but also this kind of idea of the need to teach your children this, right? It's actually good parenting. It's in their best interests and so on. So we'll get to that. I know that. But also, so you spoke about this first sensibility, and I think that does seem accurate because growing up myself, I would go to the petting zoo and then eat the animals I just saw at the petting zoo an hour later. I never made that connection. I don't think I ever really was taught that or made that individual connection as a child. And I don't know what I would have done if I had. There's the way in which you stop eating meat, but you've also eating meat and other animal products, but there's also a way in which you've dedicated your life to teaching about veganism to promoting advocacy and so on. So when was the moment, other than maybe it was the salad bar in middle school, but beyond that, as an adult, when would you say you first got kind of like radicalized for animals? And why I say that is it's, for people right in the animal movement, vegan movement, they say there's nothing radical about what we're saying, right? We just said this a moment ago. It's common sense in a sense, or it's very normal. But what I mean is that conventional thinking views veganism, animal rights as this kind of radicalization of our cultural norms. So I guess when was the moment when you said, like, I actually need to make this what I do?
So I went vegetarian at the age of 9. I went vegan in college. Something I wanted to do for a long time, had enough access over my life and food choices and what have you to go vegan. Part of what influenced me to go vegan was Carol Adams. By coincidence, she actually lived in the town that I went to college in, undergraduate, and sexual politics of meat, and this idea that dairy and egg are actually sexualized violence against the female reproductive parts of these animals was extremely convincing to me. I met my partner in college. They also went vegan at the same time, so we went vegan together. And that's when I started like real vegan activism, going to protests. And then when I graduated college, I was trying to decide between an internship with PETA and going to graduate school. And I had started having disillusionment with PETA in many ways. I was accepted. They're like, yes, you have this job with PETA. But I started having disillusionment with them, and I got into graduate school. And I decided graduate school would be a better way to actually fight for animals. So I came to graduate school with the plan of doing academic work around animals and the environment. That's what I did, and that's what I've done the whole time through. So all my publications, all the talks that I give, what have you, they're all focused on, in one sense, radicalizing fighting for animals by adding academic rigor, and at the same time radicalizing the academy by increasing focus on animals. Much better now, but I assure you 20 years ago, fighting for animals in the academy was a scandalous idea. People literally laughed at me when I first told them that that's what I was going to focus on.
So I can absolutely understand that. I mean, as an academic myself, and been in grad school, and then working as a professor, seeing the resistance to bringing animals into the fold, into the discussion of politics, into the discussion of social change, and so on. But I think it's really important. I think maybe when we see so much more of the resistance, we then realize the need to get a kind of foothold, right, in these areas in which there really is so little traction. So that's great.
Say one other thing real quickly, which is I really believe in this importance, academics who think and articulate and fight for veganism and animal liberation. So I've known many, many vegans, and this is not in any way to discourage or downplay what any vegan does. I admire and respect everything they do. At the same time, it is simply true. There's not a single person I've ever met who's gone vegan. And I say, why? And they say, because I received a flyer. And I read that flyer, and that was it. That's never happened to me. And so what I say to people is, why do you advocate for veganism in a way that didn't cause you to go vegan? And so what I can do as a professor is have classes where we read in-depth books, where we watch videos, where we have lengthy conversations. As we talked about, so many of my students, it's actually this kind of trauma they have to unpack for them to even be able to consider the idea. And so if we look at other social justice movements, whether that's in terms of race, whether it's in terms of sexual orientation, and I'm not saying these are equivalent. Obviously, I don't believe that one type of oppression is equivalent to another one. I'm only saying that we can learn lessons from other ones. What we find is there are classes and professors and research centers in all of these areas that have made huge difference in these students who have gone through these classes. Well, we need the same thing for animal liberation, for these students who actually don't have a personal guilt. I tell my students, I'm so sorry. This should not be on you. You didn't do this. You just grew up. I'm so sorry this is the world that we made. You didn't make a factory farm. And so at this critical time when they're figuring out who they are, not biased information, but we get them real information for them to be able to make real changes in their life. And so as activists, we actually really, really need to focus on building academic support for veganism and animal liberation.
So true. I really, really appreciate that sentiment. And I think when we look at how much students who get active on campuses, a lot of it comes from what they've learned in the classroom, right? What they've learned from their professors, they're actualizing it.
There's so many centers which I agree with and support and I'm actually affiliated with, but there's so many centers on gender, on race. How many centers are there on animals? I mean, a few, a smattering. How many centers are there on the environment? A few, a smattering. So why aren't we building new ones, both to teach the students and to produce important research that will actually push against the narratives that the other industry is funding? The other guys are funding academics who tend to greenwash the industry. So on both levels, I think it is a key area for us academics to work on. And it's one of the things that I love about what you're doing and why I agree to be part of this on this online course that you're creating for people to get in-depth information for anybody who wants to achieve it. I love that.
Yes, I mean, that was really my thinking in this regard, was how do we put together a place in which people can get a robust education. They can select where they're going to enter and get that education from. And I think this is a great moment to kind of pivot exactly to the course that you'll be offering for our vegan studies program and how much it is this corrective in many ways, right? Corrective to the kind of miseducation that these students have received, and how you can, over the course of multiple sessions with videos, with examples, demonstrate the veracity of it. So for our listeners, I just want to introduce this. So Dr. Stanescu is going to teach a course at Arihanta called Debunking the Myth of Sustainable and Humane Animal Agriculture. And in the course, students will focus on the greenwashing and humane washing by animal agriculture. Greenwashing is based on the different ways that animal agriculture pretends it is sustainable when it is not. And humane washing refers to the different ways that animal agriculture pretends it treats animals well when it does not. These are your professor's words, not mine. I'm just reading this right now for the audience. But in the last little bit, and then we can kind of get the information directly in the course, students will debunk the rhetorical tricks of these industries and expose the reality of the harms animal agriculture is causing to both animals and the planet. The course should be a benefit to any activist, policymaker, or person concerned about climate change, environmental destruction, or animal suffering. So this is really your area of focus, right? For years, maybe we're talking beyond decades now, maybe a couple of decades now into it, of really the kind of way that animal agriculture, if not just misrepresents, blatantly lies. I think that's right, not overstepping the case. I think this is what you want to show. And it ties into what you said. So I don't want to get too theoretical. You said you kind of look at your students and you say, I'm sorry what we've done. I'm sorry what we've taught you. And in many ways, right, it's these myths. So could you speak to our listeners a little bit about these ideas, greenwashing and humane washing, maybe individually, and then how you're going to tie those together in this course?
Absolutely. So basically my PhD was in the rhetoric program, and I'm a professor of communication. And so what I study are the ways that these companies use rhetorical tricks that they communicate, that they miscommunicate about what they're actually doing. So we mentioned greenwashing. In reality, animal agriculture is one of the most polluting industries on the planet. It produces more direct emissions than all forms of transportation combined. So it's every plane, train, automobile added together. Animal agriculture produces more direct emissions than that every single year. It consumes over 80% of any land used for humans for any purpose whatsoever. There's a huge focus right now on human overpopulation, but what there should be a focus on is actually this animal overpopulation. 80 billion land animals are killed for human consumption each and every year. Not 80 billion since there's been humans, but every year. And so, of course, this has a massive environmental impact. Joseph Poore at the University of Oxford actually studied 40 different food items at 40,000 different farms and 119 countries. Not theoretical, actually went to all of them and studied them and did a full life cycle analysis. And he found that going vegan was the single best thing any individual can do for the planet. He said it was far more important than cutting down on your flights, It was far more important than getting an electric car. One study even found that if fossil fuels vanished tomorrow, just the emissions from agriculture, the majority of which are animal agriculture, would make it impossible for us to meet the Paris Climate Accords or to prevent the 1.5 change in warming that we're worried about. So that's the reality. In response to this reality, the industry has hired a range of consultants and borrowed, in essence, a playbook from the fossil fuel industry and the tobacco industry on how to trick people into thinking that they're becoming more sustainable when in reality, they're not. And so that is what we call greenwashing, when you make rhetorical changes that try to trick consumers into thinking you've really changed the industry in significant ways, when in reality, those changes are not occurring.
Wow, that's just striking. I think when we hear those numbers, it's almost unfathomable. I mean, maybe that's part of it, right? The idea of how unbelievably harm-producing, especially with all the language of climate change, climate crisis, climate collapse, and it's almost unfathomable. So do you think that in some way the industry plays off of the unbelievability of it to the industry? Like, how could this thing that we just do normally be just so terrible for the planet? And actually all we need to do is tweak a little few things around the edges, and then things will run smoothly and everyone can go back to their normal consumption habits.
What you said is exactly correct. So both in terms of the environment and the cruelty, the humane washing, we'll get to in a minute. So the industry's own studies show that counter arguments don't work. So they have tried to produce the prettiest images of factory farms you can imagine. They're all cleaned up. They carefully follow all of Temple Grandin's advice. They're guided by these like little balloons as they move the animals around. Well, I show these in my class, and they're one of the most effective means to the students that I can show. I say, here's what the industry says is occurring, and everyone is horrified. So the prettiest that you can make a factory farm is still appalling. And so what they've learned is change the topic. Don't talk about it. Try to get people not to think about it. And that is overwhelmingly one of the rhetorical ploys that they use. Absolutely. Now, in terms of the environment and greenwashing, that's a little more complicated. They do make explicit counter arguments against the environmental effects. But you are correct that one of the ploys that they use is claims that small changes, minor fixes, will actually solve the problem. We'll feed the cows red algae. That'll fix it. Essential oils. That'll fix it. We'll change the way they compost. So with one of the papers I'm working on right now is a researcher in Canada who's claiming that he'll use brown coal, fossil fuel, in the composting technique to be able to solve the problem of ammonia from factory farms. Well, it does work to solve ammonia, but the problem is it increases the greenhouse gas emissions from animal agriculture by 2.6% because he's literally bringing in a fossil fuel. So even though some of these ideas might do the benefit they claim, what it always hides are these extra problems, and fundamentally the argument that we have to decrease the total number of animals we're raised and killed for slaughter each and every year. There's just no way that we can continue to raise and kill 80 billion land animals each and every year, regardless of the feed, regardless of the composting, regardless of giving steroids to them, which is another suggestion. Even if we did all of these, it would still be an ecological disaster.
Wow. Yeah, it is staggering. And I think when I look at the numbers and, like you said, see the videos, because I think these are two different issues in the sense that we have the environmental concerns and these small fixes, and we're going to come up with these solutions. And right, and there's a way in which the kind of myth of a solution is what keeps the consumption going, right? It's like we haven't figured it out yet. It's going to be red algae or it's going to be brown coal. All we need is these kind of techno fixes that will work out. And right, we could have another conversation about how that's all backed by the need to feed a population, and we need to feed that population on animal products, right? So that goes into a whole kind of dietary myth making about non-veganism as being this kind of necessity for humans and so on. But to keep that on the side for a minute, those aspects. But then it's also, whether we want to pivot in that direction or not, it's the humane washing aspect where, right, all we need to do is the more that we learn about animal cognition and animal behavior, yes, they have more rich lives, but all we need to do is up the welfare standards. All we need to do is consult with people like Temple Grandin. And I just want to say that, like you, I show my students like the North American Meat Institute videos. And I say, these are the industry videos. And it's amazing that when you go on YouTube, they give content warnings for them. They give content warnings for the kind of emblematic industries. And yet, what does that say? It says something like, wow, it still is that awful. And so I don't know, maybe we can, I don't know if you want to bring them together. I think we can understand that greenwashing refers to the ways in which we can do industrial animal agriculture in sustainable ways, despite the myriad publications, data sets, sources proving otherwise. So how is it in a way similar to what's going on in humane washing by these same
Absolutely.
industries?
Absolutely. So the industry is one of the most polluting industries on the planet. It is also one of the cruelest industries. So not only are we raising and killing these 80 billion land animals every single year, but often in horrific conditions. So in response to this growth of concern of people about the treatment of animals, the industry has done a couple of things. So one, they tried to suggest that factory farms, confined animal feeding operations, CAFOs, euphemistically referred to as factory farms, are themselves humane or could easily become. And the best example of this is who we've talked about, Temple Grandin, who has a list of minor changes that she suggests that she says will make the industry sustainable, and she says will make the industry good for animals. The industry does a host of other ways. One of my favorites is they'll talk about how the pigs get to be indoors, and their indoors are safe from predators, which is hilarious because obviously the only predator they really need to worry about is humans, and they are far from safe from us. That they get to have air conditioning, but literally they can't even see the light of day or ever experience the outdoors. And if they're in gestation crate, they can't even move. So they have these sort of claims to try to humane wash factory farms. The second way that they try to humane wash the industry is to these euphemistic terms like locavorism, free range, compassionate carnivore. And these is where you can sort of see the two types of greenwashing and humane washing come together. So locavorism, free range, rotational grazing, regenerative farming, pasture-raised, both usually make an environmental claim and a humane claim simultaneously. They claim, look, we're better for the environment and we're better for animals. And the debunking that we'll go through in the class is to point out two things. Both generally these claims are exaggerated or untrue. In many ways, it's worse for the environment than even CAFOs. I'll say that again. In many ways, it's worse for the environment, including worse in confined animal feeding operations. In many ways, it is not much better for animals, and in some ways even worse. So for example, they have to kill all the predators who might try to kill animal who's raised on pasture, and killing all those predators happening in horrific conditions. So it's not much better in terms of the environment, and in many ways is worse. It's not much better in terms of the animals, and in some ways it is worse. And fundamentally, and this is the most important part, increasingly it's just one industry. And so what happens is the factory farms will just repackage very similar or sometimes identical product and just market it as now pasture-raised or pasture-crafted is one of the terms they use. One of my favorite ones is Tyson has a company that you can't tell is owned by Tyson, which is called Open Pasture, and they're just raised in factory farms. And they have a question, frequently asked questions, which is, are the animals raised in pasture? And it says no. So since most of these terms are not actually regulated, and since they can make more money, what is now largely happening is the factory farms are just selling the same product to consumers at a higher profits, with the claims that it is now either green or humane, but it's not. And this is the deepest part, even critiquing factory farms, saying buy our product because factory farms are bad, even if it is in fact owned by a factory farm. And that is a level of trickery that is almost impressive, where they're literally selling even the critique of themselves to the consumers.
Wow.
With more money.
Yes, right. There's all these kind of get the loopholes also in the language, who gets to use certain terms, how they're defined. When you kind of read some of the studies, I remember a lot of the studies, right, that the Sentience Institute put out a while ago about like how we use CAFOs and the size of a CAFO, like a factory farm. How do we actually define them? And they've said something like,
Right.
even if we took the most generous understanding that, let's just say that the smallest factory farm is not a factory farm. Let's not even include those in the numbers. Let's include just these kind of medium size. You're still accounting for something like 98, 99% of all farmed animals in the United States. So that, and what you're saying is, I hope I'm following it correctly, is that that's one point. But the other point is that even doesn't matter the size, doesn't matter the location, it still would not satisfy anything we can reasonably understand as green or humane, especially if we were going to try to scale that any larger, right? Like what you alluded to earlier.
Right.
So not only, we can have a longer conversation about, what even humane refers to, what would be even a reasonable or somewhat discernible definition of humane that involves farming animals, but we don't even see anything remotely close to that happening. And I'm trying to be generous here, just kind of, saying like, what is this hypothetical situation? And it simply doesn't exist.
One of the key parts that I try to impress upon everyone is the issue of sexual violence. So every farm, all of them, it doesn't matter what label they use, all of them engage in forced breeding. For example, there is a book called The Compassionate Carnivore from author and a person who herself owns a farm, which purports to be kind and humane. And in it, she records having to engage in forced breeding in some of really the more distressing language I've ever read. She herself says it's obvious that the animal didn't want to engage in the breeding, and she has to make them do it for the farm to be able to run at all. So there are no farms that do not engage in forced breeding of the animals, even though they freely admit many of the animals don't want to engage in that activity. I rarely hear that in conversations around humane issues around farming, and I think it should be essential. No animal, including humans, should ever be forced to engage in any sexual act that they don't want to, and every farm requires it.
That's an excellent point. And I'm going to pin that for one moment because I want to ask one more question about the kind of labeling, humane washing, greenwashing. But then I really do want to pivot to maybe a discussion about how the language of, say, sexual violence towards animals is also activating to a lot of people, right? It actually, we deny that it's the same kind of issue, right? This is, you talked about Carol Adams and so many other feminist vegans, feminist animal liberation scholars have brought up how it becomes this very sensitive issue. And maybe that's why it's not talked about. So I'd like to maybe pivot in a moment to how we differentially use language for humans and animals and the kind of alleged inapplicability, right? This is the kind of the notion that it's not as bad or it's not the same thing and so on. But before we get there, you were saying things about open pasture and so on. And I myself has always been taken by the kind of insistence that even factory farms are family owned or local. And I'm curious if you could speak a little bit to this notion as if the conditions that animals are subjected to or the environmental costs are somehow offset by it happening nearby or it happening to be owned by a family.
Absolutely. That's a fantastic question. So one of the areas that I focus on somewhat uniquely in the field is what is called gray literature. So that's literature which is not academic literature. And what I focus on particularly is the gray literature of animal agriculture. So most of the texts that I spend my time reading are not works and books by vegans. I read many of them. I love them. But most of the time, what I read is actually the industry talking about what it's doing. And so to give you one example, I attended the Lethbridge, which is a city in Alberta, Canada, 2-day symposium on effective manure management. Why I do this is at these places, that's when the industry really lets their guard down. I think I can say with some certainty that I was the only critic of the animal agriculture industry to be listening in on effective manure management. And the first two presentations had nothing to do with manure management. They entirely had to do with public relations, how to trick people into believing that the industry was good and sustainable. And what these consultants told the industry to do was exactly what you were saying, to emphasize that they are family owned. And you can go today and look, and they will say, we aren't factory farms, we are farms. We're not a factory, and we're family owned. Sure, but they're family owned with 70,000 heads of cattle. And the second thing they emphasize to do is we're in your neighborhood. We're in your community. We have children just like you. We're parents, and we care about the environment because we live right with you. Maybe, but I can also tell you that some of these factory farms release 80,000 tons of manure a year, that they're subject to over 250 environmental complaints with the Canadian version of the Environmental Protection Agency, that residents in the town that they live in, including the mayor, describe the smell as something you can chew, and that they're trying to increase the number of cattle that they raise by over 28%. So yes, they 100% are using these rhetorical tricks of we're family owned and we're family, and here's our picture of our kid, and we live with you, to hide the reality of what the industry is doing, which is massively polluting and massively harming the communities where they live. No one wants to live around a factory farm. Overwhelmingly, it's poor people and people in color of a type of intersectional violence about poverty and race who have a host of health conditions and terrible living conditions, and they just can't move because they can't afford to go someplace else. That's the reality, and they hide it with this verbiage of family, being family owned and living in the community.
And there also seems to be a way in which it traffics in the prioritization of kind of economics, jobs, local welfare, but still with the sense that, yes, there might be issues, but, we're really bolstering the community. And also it's kind of this anthropocentrism, right? It's really always bringing it back to how it's benefiting humans in some way. And as long as we're giving some kind of modicum of alleged decency to the animals, it's really all that matters. But that what we're actually doing is feeding people, once again, allegedly healthy foods, and also helping kind of like local economies, right? And it really feeds into, right? I read your article, right? The Selling Eden, about this kind of image that also it's leaning on, right? And maybe we can wrap up this segment of just, it seems like the greenwashing and the humane washing is on some bygone image that we're trying to reproduce. And do you think that's like an undercurrent of the messaging as well?
Exactly right. And that's why we have to think of the two of them together, united. And so while I've been studying this kind of locavore movement, people who try to eat within a small geographic space and have different ideas about how animals should be treated, in things like Michael Pollan's The Hour's Dilemma or Food Inc., I was very confused because many of these people who talk about free range, organic, or locavore will keep referencing nature, how it's better for the environment, but they wouldn't cite anything. There were no studies. And all of the studies that we have overwhelmingly say the opposite, that it's not scalable, that it's not sustainable, that in many ways greenhouse gas emissions from local or pasture-raised animals is even worse than confined animal feeding operations. And I really got kind of an insight. So I had this opportunity to debate Joe Salatin. So Joe Salatin owns Polyface Farms, and he's one of the most famous spokespeople for this idea that free range or organic farming is the way to go. And so I got to have a public debate with him in Vermont, and I was so excited, and I did all this research, and I was really ready for it. This clash of the minds. And I come there, and what he actually said is, yeah, I don't believe in science, and I don't believe in climate change. And it was so eye-opening. And I realized, well, if he doesn't believe in science and he doesn't believe in climate change, when he's referencing nature, he means something completely different. And what I have come to believe is when they talk about nature, what they really mean is this kind of Aristotelian natural order of humans benignly ruling over other animals. And that's where the greenwashing and the humane washing come together. And so in their mind, God has ordained that humans should benignly rule over other animals. And that's the natural system, like natural law. That's the way things are supposed to work. And so they're trying to go back to the system. And so even though they keep talking about nature, they don't mean peer-reviewed studies of the greenhouse gas emissions of these animals that they're producing, they mean they believe there's a right way the world is supposed to operate, that God has made, that they're trying to get us back to. And that, I think, is part of the appeal of something that has virtually no scientific data behind it at all.
Wow. And I mean, that must have been such an experience, right? To go armed with all of this data, this science, these facts, and really have them have no weight in that discussion and maybe, or with that individual. So I guess to bring that around, because this is the other side or one side that's contributing to a different narrative. You know, at Arihanta, we really are trying to teach the things that you've described have been taught out of us: nonviolence, compassion, multi-species ethical vision, you know, and even in a sense, a certain form of biocentrism at times. So kind of turn in a little bit of a different direction. You know, what do you recommend? I mean, how do you think that we can engage with students or the public, our families, in ways that take into consideration, like you're saying, that flyers might not work, right? Handing out the flyers doesn't work. Human psychology doesn't seem to be working that way. So what are some of your suggestions?
That question, I'll say two things. First, I will say I'm not a Jain, but I consistently have admired and respected Jainism. Some of my students have been Jains who have taken the class specifically because they wanted a class about vegetarian or veganism. I'll tell you one true story of a Jain student. This is while I was teaching at Stanford. One of my students was a Jain, and she said, "Is there a cap on the number of pages that I can write for the paper?" And I was like, "No." And it was a 15-page paper, and I was like, "Well, I'll stop reading after 15, but you can write as much as you want." She turned in a 50-page paper. 50 pages. I was like, that is a master's thesis. So, and one of the things that I love is this idea of, look, we can have a spirituality that still allows for caring for animals and ethical commitment to animals and veganism. And it actually flips this selling eat an idea that's currently being sold. It says, look, there's a different way to question this sort of natural law model. And I love that. What we can do, I believe in, what the website is about, what I'm focusing on, is issues of solidarity. Individually, we can't do a lot. Number one thing we can do for animals is to organize and to focus on issues of solidarity, both with other people fighting for animal liberation and other people fighting for issues of social justice. And we need to make those movements stronger and more powerful. My particular focus is on bringing together the environmental movement and the animal liberation movement into a focused fight, both in terms of people who are fighting for animals realizing that non-human animals are going to be the hardest hit by the effects of climate change. Almost nothing is going to cause more pain and violence and species extinction, which we're already going through in climate change. Everyone who is a vegan has to be a radical environmentalist. There's simply no other option. And at the same time, trying to help environmentalists to understand exactly what we talked about before, that there is in fact no sustainable strategy to deal with the destruction of the environment that doesn't take seriously the need to vastly decrease the animal agriculture that we produce in the world. So that's one small example, but that mold across the board is what I believe in. But we need to re-articulate animal liberation, not as just a diet, but as a social justice movement in solidarity with other social justice movements fighting for the world that we truly believe in and want to achieve.
Wow, that's certainly inspiring. Normally, I'd say we could just stop right there, but I do want to emphasize that point because this is that critique, and we don't have to get into it, but this idea that both internally and externally, the animal justice movement, the vegan movement, however we want to describe them, has often been isolated from other movements. And partially that comes from a desire for animals to, have their own movement. I've spoken about this myself. But also what that does is it sometimes permits, I'm not even going to say opponents, I'm going to say those who are resistant or those even who support human justice, but find animal justice to be this kind of taking a portion of the pie, right? We have to figure out the human justice issues first. But once you realize that all of these issues are completely and deeply entangled and enmeshed, they use the same categories, they use the same forms of hierarchy and oppression and exploitation, that if I'm understanding you correctly, like solidarity is the only option.
Yeah. So when I talk to somebody, I don't come at them with a bunch of statistics or things that I care about right off the gate. I ask them what they care about. And whatever they care about, I explain how animal liberation is in solidarity with that goal. If they care about workers' rights, well, the factory farm is the most exploitive working conditions imaginable. The turnover rate in a factory farm is over 100%. Literally every single employee is hired and fired every year. And the conditions are horrible. If they care about immigration, CAFOs actually recruit people in other countries, bring them over illegally, intentionally, because no one wants these terrible jobs, ruthlessly exploit them, and anytime they try to unionize or complain, call INS and deport them. They actually put them in these kind of like factory towns. And I've actually been there where they like have these apartments attached to the factory farm, and they deduct the rent and the utilities for all the people who work in the factory farm out of their wages, in kind of the worst imagery of like almost sharecropping kind of stuff and exploitation. So whatever issue you care about, if it's reproductive justice, if it's bodily autonomy, if it's LGBTQ plus rights, if it's anti-Blackness, if it's poverty, if it's colonialism, explain, look, here is what you care about already, and here is how this is an expression of the values you already hold. That is what I want to tell to every single person.
Wow, that's powerful. Again, I keep finding myself saying wow, because I do think these statistics, these intersections, the relevance of this to so many people, really no matter their starting point, like you're saying, it's kind of unavoidable, part of their life. It's part of their gaze. And I hope that our students take the class, Debunking the Myth of Sustainable and Humane Animal Agriculture. And whether it's their first class in vegan studies at Arihanta or their second, they come to it later on. I really hope it inspires them to see these intersections, see how they are in many ways the victims of certain forms of propaganda, and also helps them go even further. Like you're saying, start there, get that education, go further, learn about class, race, ability, the environment, and all of these intersections that will only motivate them further to maybe take action for themselves or for animals. So in that respect, is there anything else you would like to say to close us off here?
Every talk and every podcast that I give, we have pretty good data on why people don't stay vegan, what we call the recidivism rate. And it's overwhelmingly because they feel isolated and alone and stigmatized. Kind of like I did when I was 9 in a small town in Georgia with only one vegetarian in the whole town. And so what I want to end on is how grateful I am to each of you. If you are vegetarian, if you are vegan, if you are fighting for animal liberation, you are not alone. We are in solidarity together. I am with you 110%. And we are going to keep fighting and working together till we win, and we are going to win. Thank you.
No, thank you. And thank you all for joining the Engaged Jain Studies podcast. We hope you continue to listen to so many of our offerings with great speakers. And I hope you, like me, have really enjoyed our talk today. And thank you so much, Dr. Stanescu, for your research, your insight, your vision, and your inspiration. Thanks again.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to the Engaged Jain Studies podcast, brought to you by Arihanta Institute, an IRC 501c3 nonprofit California corporation. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe, leave us a review on your favorite podcast platform, or better yet, tell a friend and share it with a colleague. At Arihanta Institute, we bridge ancient wisdom with contemporary living through accessible, self-paced online courses, free events, and a first-of-its-kind Master of Arts program in Engaged Jain Studies. Visit arihantainstitute.org to learn how our curriculum spanning Jain philosophy, social justice, veganism, environmental studies, and more can enrich your understanding of timeless principles in today's context. Jai Jinendra.